Thank you all for joining this special meeting of the Standing Panel on Executive Organization and Management of the National Academy of Public Administration. Um, we've moved from a regular monthly meeting to sort of an ad hoc meeting to handle some of the big emerging issues in executive branch management that have emerged over the last several years. And my friend Ed DeSev thought that this subject would be a great one for a panel meeting. And so we're featuring today a manifesto that was created under the auspices of Reform for Results. And a subset of the authors of that manifesto, which is about the need to radically reform the federal budget process, are going to present that to us today. Before I hand it over to Phil, let me just ask that everybody mute yourselves while folks are presenting. And if you could put your questions in the chat, we will handle those after the presentation. So if nobody has any questions before we start, I'll hand it over to Phil Joyce, who's probably well known to all of you, professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and one of the country's leading experts on the federal budget process. Thanks for your work on this, Phil, and to the rest of the authors. But thanks also for being here today. So I hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Robert. So there are three of us that are going to present this today, but I want to give credit to the other three that are part of the Reform for Results team, which is Ed DeSev and Terry Gullo and Doug Cristello. And so what we're going to be talking about today is a joint product of the six of us, and we have been working really for the last year under the auspices of Reform for Results.
Sorry about all of it.
Whoever is not muted should mute yourselves, please.
Thank you, Phil.
So what we're going to do today is we hope to spend no more than about 30 minutes kind of talking about what we're up to, and then leave plenty of time for Q&A. So if we could go on to if Jillian, I don't see the slides, so if you could put them up, then we'll get started.
Hopefully you can see my screen.
There we go. There you are. Okay, so if you can go to the second slide. So there are really three pieces to this, and each one of us is going to sort of take a piece. My job here is to try to talk about some past reform efforts and what they were trying to do, and then to document some major current problems in federal budgeting, which probably I don't need to spend much time on for a group that would choose to come and listen to this. And then Roy is going to do the second part, which is sort of the meat of this, which is to talk about 10 standards for effective budgeting, which he initially had developed 30 years ago, but which have stood the test of time, and he has sort of updated them. And then in the third part, Steve Redburn is going to talk about the need for a radical reform agenda and lay out some sort of key questions that we think should be the focus of any reform effort. So if we can move on. So, reform of the budget process is nothing new. And probably, again, those of you who are on this call don't need to be told anything that's on here, but just sort of briefly to talk about what the various reforms, really in the last 100 years and what they were trying to do have been, starting with the Budget and Accounting Act in 1921, which created the executive budget and, important fiscal institutions, which the Bureau of the Budget, which became the Office of Management Budget, and then GAO, and then the important President Commission on Budget Concepts in 1967, establishing sort of conventions for budgeting and federal accounting. And then the Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which was really trying to reassert the congressional role in budgeting and create an infrastructure for budgeting at sort of a macro level, but also created the budget committees and CBO. And then the deficit-based budget reforms of the 1980s and 1990s, things like Graham-Rudman, Budget Enforcement Act, et cetera. And then after 1990, a lot of the reforms have been focused on trying to bring more performance information into the budget process, things like the CFO Act and GPRA, and then the GPRA Modernization Act. Next slide, please. But shock, federal budgeting is now broken. What is the evidence that federal budgeting is broken? Well, we have a few sort of pieces of evidence, and this does not represent every way that the federal budget process is broken. But first, an exploding debt, and an exploding debt is not itself a process problem, but I think it is a process problem that we have no overall fiscal goal. And the debt, in fact, has risen from less than 40% of GDP in 2008 to more than 100% of GDP now. And I think importantly, there are no current norms that are guiding overall fiscal policy, whether that norm is debt as a percentage of GDP or a balanced budget or anything else. It is particularly timely to talk about the lack of timeliness in the process. And that has a couple of problems. First, routinely government by continuing resolution, but then even more significantly, periodic harmful government shutdowns. We already had one government shutdown this year, the longest one in history. We are on the verge potentially of another government shutdown, which is going to affect fewer agencies, but nonetheless is going to be damaging. And it's not only about the appropriations process. In fact, no budget deadlines are routinely met. The president's budget is now routinely late. The budget resolution is not enacted on time. And of course, especially the appropriations process, and that contributes to a reduction in the effectiveness of government, but also loss of public trust. Next slide, please. Next, please. Third, no, I'm sorry, go back. Third, the norms of budgeting that are reflected mostly in relationships between the branches have collapsed. Executive orders have been very prevalent in the Trump administration, but they're not new. Executive orders had been used as a substitute for legislating. But what we have seen, in particular, recently in this administration, is more unilateral executive actions, most specifically impoundments threatening the congressional power of the purse, and the whole sort of notion of, who has the authority, to sort of set the parameters of federal spending is under threat. And then improved information, which I think it is without question that the amount of information that participants have has improved, but it has not led to improved fiscal outcomes, and it has not necessarily led to desired improvements, at least at the level that I think should happen in government performance. So you have agencies like CBO and GAO providing the Congress with better data, but they're frequently ignored. And I would go beyond frequently ignored. They are sometimes attacked by the very institution, meaning the Congress, that they're supposed to be supporting. And reforms such as GPRA, I think it is unquestionably true. They've substantially improved the availability of performance data, but those data have not been routinely used by Congress and the White House. Next slide, please. So how should we address these problems? Deciding how to deal with these and other challenges, I think, requires us to ask a simple question. And that simple question, which is has complicated answers, which Roy's going to talk about in a minute, is what do we expect an effective budget process to do? And if we want to answer that question, it requires us to analyze the myriad things that we expect the budget process to accomplish. So our approach in this manifesto is to start with a comprehensive listing of the norms for a well-functioning budget process. Only then can we identify where we're falling short and what we might do then in response. So having set that up, I'm going to turn it over to Roy, who's going to talk about where we might find those norms for an effective budget process.
Thanks, Phil. And could we go to the next slide? I want to start by saying it's been a great pleasure to work with my 5 colleagues, all of whom really done great work over their careers on federal budgeting and financial management. The approach of my article about 30 years ago will remind a lot of you of some of the literature that we either read or taught in public administration, the debate between Wildavsky and the rationalists. But mostly what I did was collate and organize statements by budget practitioners that justified their arguments about how the budget process should work. And I identified 10 standards for good budgeting. And last fall on Substack, I updated that previous article, which I'm drawing from today. Recently, Steve brought to my attention a OECD report called Quality Budget Institution. If you need some reading material, it's 178 pages long, and it compares practices in a lot of countries that are members of OECD. And one thing I liked about it, among many things, is that it had a list of 10 standards that were pretty similar to mine. So I'm going to start with the 3 out of 10 standards where I think the record is pretty good, at least in my opinion, until this year. So next slide, please. And the first is that the idea that budgets should be comprehensive. And historically, again, that's been pretty good. Phil mentioned the fiscal 69 adoption of the unified budget. Another example of increasing comprehensiveness was in 1985 when OMB Director Dave Stockman took some programs that both Democrats and Republicans had tried to hide off budget and put them back on budget. Another move towards comprehensiveness occurred several decades before that, in 1968, when Stanley Surrey, who was the head of the Office of Tax Policy, published the first list of tax expenditures. And similar publications are now issued by Joint Committee on Taxation. But as a negative, that form of spending is still not well integrated into the budget process. And getting to what's happening this year, and what happened last year. Last year, OMB did not publish a list of tax expenditures. The analytical perspectives volume went missing in most of its parts, nor did President Trump submit a complete budget. So that is really a blow towards comprehensiveness. In addition, the administration has made a lot of industrial policy deals that appear to be inadequately captured by current budget concepts. Next slide, please. Second standard is legitimate, the idea that important budget decisions are made by legally responsible authorities. And under the Constitution and with the laws that Congress and President have adopted, that starts with the presidential submission of the budget, followed by Congress passing laws, and the executive then spending in accordance with those laws. And that's the way it's usually worked, and worked well with some important exceptions, such as Nixon's impoundments. The downside has been micromanagement by Congress. And I think we probably have a range of opinions about whether that's a minor nuisance or a major problem. To prevent any misunderstanding of that last statement, though, I want to make at least a personal comment that I think it's the right of Congress and its duty to use appropriations bills to ensure that federal agencies follow the Constitution and statutory law for both citizens and non-citizens alike. That's the issue that's central to the likely shutdown that's coming up. There's no question that budget legitimacy has taken a huge hit over the past year. The Trump administration has engaged in a multi-front war on Article 1, with congressional Republicans often collaborating. And Phil has made the point in 2 really excellent articles that really is pretty short-sighted for Republicans because they're going to be in the minority at some time. Arguably, this loss of legitimacy is the greatest problem we have now with federal budgeting. Next slide, please. Honesty is the third area where I think we've been pretty good as a country. And in fact, arguably the US has been world-class in this respect in many areas, particularly with our economic statistics agencies and some of the work done by CBO and OMB to some extent. We still have some challenges with budget concepts, and it's also the case that both Democrats and Republicans use macroeconomic assumptions that are too optimistic at times. But right now we have a tragic situation where the economic statistics agencies have been attacked, such as the firing of the BLS director, And as Phil mentioned, CBO and GAO have been under attack too. A final point on honesty: to broaden the interpretation of this standard, it's worth remembering that one reason governments adopted executive budgets at the beginning of the 20th century was to promote honesty. And to do that, they wanted to empower the executive. And that was supposed to limit corruption, and it did. You may have seen the New York Times last week that reported that President Trump directly earned $1.4 billion last year from his actions. And that doesn't include his family's earnings, nor does it count the much greater earnings of donors who have enjoyed regulatory leniency and budget favoritism. Next slide, please. Now, the remaining several standards, in my opinion, performance ranges from fair to terrible. And under transparency, I'd have to say that that's fair to poor. In the OECD report I mentioned, there are 39 text boxes on exemplary practices that these different countries exhibit. And there's only one on US practices about credit form, which was an increase in budget transparency, an excellent one. But reality is that most citizens do not understand budget decisions or the budget process. And that's understandable given its unnecessary complexity and abundant jargon. The nadir of that, if you want to define budgeting broadly, is the Doge wall of receipts, which didn't add up, to put it charitably. There are a lot of OECD countries that provide better information to their citizens about the budget. One example I really like is the Netherlands, which provides pre-election budget analyses of the many different parties' platforms. Next slide, please. Timeliness. Well, the base level of this is obviously terrible, and I don't need to repeat what Phil said. All I will say is that something's very wrong when the good news is that appropriations may be passed 1/3 into the fiscal year. Next slide, please. Cooperative. And this is not something that's often discussed when we talk about the budget process, but I think it's tremendously important. And here I would say I think the process is quite poor. That we spend so much time on unresolved budgetary conflicts. And that means less time is spent than is desirable on three things. First of all, the oversight of governmental programs. Second, on designing more effective policies. And third, on what we probably should start with in the first place, which is better understanding current conditions in the country. It's also been the trend for the last 3 decades that party leaders are not allowing legislative committees to go to work. That is, there's not a cooperative relationship between the leaders and the committees. It's just leadership dominance. And we believe that the reforms of the budget process in Congress more generally should re-empower the committees. I'm not going to get into the monetary policy issue, but we can talk about that later if we want to. Next slide, please. Perceptive, looking long term. And here we can have some differences of opinion, I would think, about whether it's fair to poor. I'm just going to describe 2 cases in which I think the budget is not adequately considering the long term. The first is that we all know that current projections are that Social Security can pay fully scheduled benefits only for the next 6 to 7 years. But we also know that we've known about that problem for many years before now. And in fact, recent legislation from 2024 and 2025 made the problem worse. Second, we had this recent fight about whether to extend the enhanced health insurance premium subsidies, which is just the latest example of many so-called cliffs, when spending increases and tax cuts that sponsors truly intend to be permanent are first enacted only as temporary. Just thinking about investments more broadly, it's hard to argue that the federal government invests well. And we don't have time to talk about all the aspects, but I want to mention one thing, which is in its own capacities. One counterexample is the U.S. Digital Services Team, but that's now defunct, and in fact killed by Doge, which carried out a lot of personal actions that have been short-sighted, killing institutional knowledge in the agencies, which will have budget impacts for years to come. Next slide, please. The 8th standard, judgmental budgets. and Phil mentioned this as well. I think you'd have to say that the base level is perhaps fair. We did adopt GIPRA, and there have been substantial improvements in the executive branch for that. The process sometimes does generate value for money, including through traditional reviews by appropriations and authorizing committees. However, it's, I think, important to realize that committee jurisdictions and the separation between appropriations, authorizations, and revenue legislation means that in many policy sectors, policies are uncoordinated. My favorite examples are health policy and housing policy. A portfolio budgeting approach that Steve has advocated in the past would reduce this problem. Next slide, please. Okay, constrained. And there are different ways of defining this. Budgeting limiting the amount of money that need be acquired by government. Fair to poor, perhaps. We've had a steady growth of entitlements and step increases in deficits from the financial crisis, COVID, and tax bills. And we could have differences of opinion about whether those were intelligent or not. But what we don't have is a regular extended debate about the extent to which deficits should be constrained. Both parties have really been shirking their responsibility to have that debate. And we now have a debt market that's sending signals that it doubts there is an effective process for constraint. If you look at the yield premiums on long bonds, and I think those signals are going to intensify. Next slide, please. And the final standard of responsiveness, that budget policies match public preferences. And the base level here is I don't have a clue about how to figure out what this is, how to grade it. One way of thinking about this is to look at the responses by citizens to simplistic polling questions. The way that polls are often framed, citizens say they simultaneously want higher spending, lower taxes, and balanced budgets. Yes, that's irrational, but it's also the message that citizens often get from the partisan political process. And so somehow we need to figure out how to do a better job in educating citizens and helping politicians respond to the best interests of the citizens. Next slide, please. I hope you can use that list of 10 standards to help you with your thinking about how the process can be improved. To me, the standards where we need most improvement are legitimacy, constraint, and judgmental. Your priorities may differ. As with budget policy, there are also potential trade-offs and synergies between the reforms that can be adopted. The last couple bullets talk about political feasibility, and perhaps we can discuss those ideas after Steve Redburn's conclusion to our presentation and in response to your comments and questions. Thanks. Steve?
Thanks, Roy. So Roy and Phil have made the case. I hope everyone will agree that patching the current process is not an option, that there are major weaknesses that have to be addressed, and that we're going to need some big ideas for comprehensive reform of that process. And we're going to need others to help us develop those, and starting today. And we recognize that we need to draw on experience to the extent we can and evidence of what works. And we have to recognize that there are constraints. One of the biggest constraints being the constitutional structure that divides responsibility and authority between the legislative and executive branches, and also the limits on institutional and individual capacity or capability, and politics, a small word, but a heavy lift. And we have to recognize the incentives that the major actors all face that shape their decisions. So how do we organize for this next stage? Next slide, please. What we've begun to do is identify some lines of inquiry that we want to pursue in depth. And the first is and these are each is addressed to a major set of weaknesses that we've identified, or as you can see in parentheses, addressed to the standards of good budgeting that Roy just summarized. how can Congress and the president collaborate to enact timely budgets in an era of polarization and given institutional obstacles? What we want to see is a perhaps less cumbersome process that doesn't get in the way of people working and slows things down. We want to also perhaps experience suggests that there are too many decisions that have to be made in the limited time available prior to the beginning of a fiscal year, and that we may need to make the workload less onerous for people. So we need to think about how to approach that. And unfortunately, there are not so many relevant international examples, certainly parliamentary systems where authority is concentrated in one branch in the government, which has the majority and therefore doesn't really need to make a strong case for its budget to Parliament. That's not very useful for our thinking. But there are some presidential systems. I think it's also we're going to look at the relationships between governors and state legislatures, because states have a similar constitutional structure where responsibility for developing and enacting the budget is divided between the two branches. So we will work through those examples and see if we can find states that have developed processes that work more smoothly. So that's just to give you an example. Another line of inquiry. Julian, next slide. How can the public be given a meaningful role in formulating budgets? One that allows them to develop an informed consensus on what priorities are and how to deploy resources to meet the biggest policy challenges, and to rebuild legitimacy and trust in the process. With current process, I think it's fair to say there's a culture of secrecy around the process. Many of the procedures are arcane. The terminology and its application is arcane, mysterious to nearly everybody outside the Beltway and maybe most people inside the Beltway. There's certainly, as has been emphasized already, a lack of transparency, especially now. So we need to somehow open the process up, make the public able to understand what's going on, and perhaps also give them a role in deliberations prior to or as part of the development of the budget. A couple of countries that OECD has looked at as case studies have a role for citizens to play on a recurring basis as budgets are developed. Ireland is one example where there's a regular two-way dialogue every year about the economic and budget outlook. Canada has experimented with this. There are very limited examples, but there are other people working on what's sometimes called deliberative democracy, and we might look at their practical examples. There, for example, Jim Fishman at Stanford has conducted a large number of practical experiments, experimentally designed deliberative democracy exercises focused on how to get people to reach, think through and reach consensus on big, tough policy questions. And some of that could be adapted perhaps to the budget process. So that's just, again, just an opening suggestion of how we might approach that problem. Third, how can budgets be informed, decisions be informed by evidence and a strategic approach to achieving the highest policy priorities? Roy mentioned the work that Paul Posner and I did a few years ago on portfolio budgeting, which starts with not the unit of analysis being as it is now, the program or the budget account, but a major policy objective, and then looks at the whole set of or portfolio of spending programs, tax expenditures, regulations, other policies that are relevant to achieving that policy objective. And what we're doing now with resources constitutes essentially, implicitly, the current strategy for achieving progress on that front. And then to go into depth about how to use resources more effectively, more strategically to achieve better results and better return on public investment. And again, there's a lot of work to be done to develop that set of ideas and make it practical. So, but it is a way to bring tax expenditures, the widely overlooked part of federal spending, to bring them more directly into the budget process, and to take less time with marginal questions about how do you increase this program by X dollars or decrease it by X dollars, and instead to focus more of the time and energy in the process on these big questions. Around the world, these are known as spending reviews. Many countries conduct systematic spending reviews each year. Okay, next slide. A couple more of these. Julian, there you go. So once budgets are enacted, how can the executive be held accountable for following the law and achieving promised results as the budget is executed? Problem that's very salient today. I could say that I could think like an economist and say let's assume a president who will faithfully execute the laws, and that in prior years that's been most of the time a pretty safe assumption to make. So let's assume that. So at some point we'll have a different situation where people are committed to a more open and honest and legitimate process instead of unilateral actions that test the boundaries of executive authority. Some people will be inclined to enact new laws to try to impose additional constraints on the executive. But the first step, of course, is to use the laws that are in place and to commit to following those. And finally, at the same time, we're worried about constraint and legitimacy and honesty. We have to think about how the executive can be given the tools and flexibility needed to effectively implement enacted budgets and to manage for results. In other words, we don't want the executive to be so hamstrung that they can't that the government can't be agile in the face of changing conditions, can't be strategic, looking over the long horizon and planning and investing for future growth and to meet major policy objectives in a sustainable way. All of that requires, given where we are, significant new investments in the public sector's capacity in the form of IT systems and new business processes that will take advantage of AI and other evolving, emerging opportunities on the technical side. So we need to think through how to do that. There was I'll just mention this one example of what we can draw on. A roundtable organized by the IBM Center for the Business of Government and the Shared Services Leadership Coalition 2 years ago, which resulted in a report that contains a large number of ideas of varying degrees of ambition about how to use the budget process to improve federal management. Perhaps somebody could put a link to that in the chat. So that report is known as Opportunities for Management when Budgeting. So those are some of the lines of inquiry that we are pursuing, and we hope others will join us. And I'm going to hand it over now to Ed to kind of summarize and elaborate on that invitation. Ed Sev.
Ed DeSiv is unmuting. Thank you. Jillian, as we talk, would you please look at the questions in the chat and start setting up a queue for us? I'll let you be the arbiter of which order the questions go in. You may have noticed we had more than 100 participants in this session. We would have had more, but we had a technical glitch that limited us at 100, and we'll try to get rid of that glitch sometime in the future. The group today is one that I'm especially pleased to see. When I look at the names, there are people who I've worked with over the years and people who have a serious concern about how to make budgeting a more important exercise, a more important part or fiscal policy. We were careful here to deal only with budget process. We didn't try to get into the ideas around the substance of the budget. Should it be balanced? Should it be capped as a percentage of GDP as to its deficits and so on? Those are questions which we may deal with at some point in the future, but they're fundamentally political questions. And we decided that we were not going to step into the political arena. There are many others who are out there or already in that arena, and we will consult with them, and we will consult with others on the Hill. There are several bills on the Hill that have been either introduced or are awaiting introduction, and we'll work with the minority and majority staffs in those committees to have this conversation, perhaps in a condensed form, for the staffs and ultimately perhaps for the members themselves, because setting up a template the way Roy has done and the way Steve has done may provoke, hopefully, and hope is not a strategy, may provoke, hopefully, some willingness to engage in reform. We don't expect over the next 2 or 3 years to see something jump full blown from the head of Zeus. Not at all. But if we didn't start the conversation now, and that's what Reform for Results is really about. I see Frank Fukuyama is on the call today, and I thank and welcome him. Frank has been a leader along with Don Kettle and Paul Verkyle and others in trying to say, let's think about the long term. Let's think about the major problems as to regulation, as to permitting, as to changes in the personnel system itself that we really ought to focus on. And I want to agree with Roy that this is the small group we have here is a terrifically harmonious one, and we really have had a good time doing this, believe it or not. And that brings you to question our own psyches and why the hell we would think that was a wonderful idea. But we do, and we all do. However, we welcome your comments, and we will try to, as best we can, codify those comments and put it in a document somewhere that we will continually refresh over time. This production here today is being recorded, and if you missed some of it, some people were unfortunately shut out at the beginning. If you missed some of the comments, we would be delighted if you'll send Jillian, who's I think on Jillian McGuffey, who's on the list, send her a request or send me a request. Now, Robert Shea was nice enough to give over an EOM panel to this, and I want to tell him how much I appreciated that giving over, because it gave us a place to stand. It gave us a place within NAPA to stand. We don't expect that this is a product of NAPA. It's a product of Reform for Results, and we'll keep working on it. With that, Jillian, I'm going to put you to work and ask you to pose the first question.
So Ed, Jillian has handed me that baton because
congratulations, Robert.
she's
Wonderful.
She's handling this very exciting development, is which we've gotten more attendees than any EOM panel, which means we've exceeded the 100-person cap, and she's trying to fix that right now.
Well, we appreciate that, Robert. We know that we knew that was going to be the case when we did impoundment, working with our friends at Arnold in July. We were over 150. So I very much expected that, especially under the umbrella of EOM. I mean, my goodness.
That's right. It's cold fusion here at Napa this afternoon. Let me raise 2 points that Don Eggert and Virginia Huth raised, and they get to guardrails. Don raised the prospect of ignoring the Impoundment Act, and Virginia the Anti-Deficiency Act, two sides of the same coin. Let's say the Supreme Court rules that the president's authority over for impoundments can't be constrained by things like the Impoundment Act or the Anti-Deficiency Act. What recourse do we have to, bring more uh, what's the word strictures to the budget process? And let me say by thanking the speakers and authors of this manifesto. I put a link to it in the chat. What kinds of recommendations would you be looking for that would restore some of those constraints on executive authority and bring some, bounds to the budget process overall?
Phil, let me put that one in your lap because you're Mr. Impoundment.
Yeah, I was afraid you'd do that. Um, so, honestly, I'm not very hopeful at the point at which the Supreme Court decides that the separation of powers was a bad idea. That there's a lot that we can do. I mean, one of the things that really has sort of struck me, and I've talked to some people who I used to work with on the Hill about this, is how much of what we viewed as prior common practice was based not on laws but on norms. That is that the presumption was that people were operating, I hate to use a football, analogy, but that people were operating within the 40-yard lines, right? And sometimes we went in one direction, sometimes we went another, but there were general rules about the relationships between the branches in particular, that people were following. At the point at which one or more actors are unwilling to sort of follow those norms, and if it gets challenged in court and the Supreme Court says that's all fine, then I think we're back to, are we sort of electing people who fundamentally believe in the Constitution and the separation of powers or not? I don't think I don't think reforms in the budget process can can solve what are fundamentally political problems. So I think it is important that those um, that those violations of things like the Impoundment Control Act and the Anti-Deficiency Act are identified when they occur, and that people understand that this is a fundamental challenge to the congressional power of the purse. And to reiterate the point that Roy had raised, I think it is particularly short-sighted of Republicans in Congress to not be protecting congressional prerogatives, because that even if all I cared about was my own political party, my party will not always be in control of the White House. And so I think somehow this has to relate to this sort of broader, not only public education, but education of those in the political process of why it is that the separation of powers actually matters. And that's not a hopeful answer to the question, I'm afraid.
Well, I guess the other side of that is what if those authorities if it's ruled that the president exceeded his authority, you still need improvements to appropriations language, and you do see the Congress asserting its authority
Right,
at least a little bit in the current drafts, right?
right,
They're rectifying some flexibilities that they didn't know they granted.
right.
So what would you be looking for then?
Well, I think that's a good point. I think that, what that would invite, if the Congress was willing to stand up for itself, what that would invite, presidential overreach, could invite the Congress being much more explicit and about, what it is that it is expecting out of the appropriations. Now, that creates its own problem. We talked about micromanagement. What we may be doing, and Steve and I have had this conversation in the past, is to the extent that this encourages more congressional micromanagement of the executive branch, that could have its own, sort of negatives. But I would expect if the Congress was going to stand up for itself, that what we would see is much more detailed language in appropriation bills, to try to constrain the ability of the executive branch.
Steve, yeah.
So yeah, Phil and I have had this conversation. I'm concerned that people not assume that every president will be like the current president in writing a bunch of detailed instructions that try to bind the executive, which may or may not succeed, but will certainly degrade its capacity to deliver results. So we need to think about that at the same time we think about restoring accountability. And I think the pendulum is my optimism is that the pendulum will swing because it has swung many times.
I love your optimism.
I could add
Steve.
one thing to that. Most political scientists like myself are still shocked that this has happened. If you when I came to work in Congress, Jamie Wooden was the chair of appropriations, and it's what has happened now is, of course, be unimaginable to him and almost all appropriators before now. So one explanation is that the behavior of Republican appropriators is somewhat similar to the behavior that Kent Weaver identified in a classic paper wrote about blame avoidance. That is, they may be willing to see some of these cuts that have been put in place through impoundment, but they're unwilling to vote for them. And this way they're able to get the results, but without having to go back to the constituents and say, yes, I did vote for that cut. But of course, as Steve mentioned, the pendulum was likely to swing back because that's not a sustainable strategy.
Right. So Ed, Jeff Lovers, I hope I pronounced that right, wanted to dive deep in reconciliation. Are they limited to one per session? The Senate parliamentarian performed heroic work, but how likely is that she'll be circumvented the next time? Why aren't the GOP leaders moving to do another one? They actually are. They're planning one this summer. And does it need reform or abolishment? Any discussion about fiddling with reconciliation? Who wants to answer that? Anybody?
I'll start.
Yeah.
The idea of the parliamentarian performed a heroic service, perhaps. But if you look at Bill Douster's remarkably long compendium of budget process laws, you can find there are, I think, 250 or so pages on precedents of trying to understand what fits under the Byrd rule and what doesn't. And if you look through those precedents, it'd be hard to see much logic to them about what's budgetary or not. So to me, that's an indication that the Byrd rule is not very helpful, and for that matter, reconciliation isn't either. Personally, I'd be happy with it going away, but only if it were replaced with more radical reforms. And one of the things that we're going to try and figure out is how could Congress make it much more likely that committees would have the ability to bring bills to the floor? And that, in addition, opponents of those bills would have the opportunity to offer amendments. So that's one of the topics that sounds as if it may not be that related to reconciliation, but I think when you really get into it, it's strongly related.
If I could just add, I wrote a paper for the 50th anniversary of the Budget Act, an event that should be commemorated but not celebrated. That really raised this question because my view is that the two biggest impacts of the 1974 Budget Act have been CBO and reconciliation. And the question is, this fourth question, does it need reform or abolishment? I interviewed a bunch of people, who are sort of have been participants in the process, and there were sort of 3 points of view. One was there was a group of people that said it should be abolished because no good has ever come of it. And what they meant was all the things that have been done through reconciliation have added to the deficit. So that's the deficit hawk point of view. There's a second point of view that basically said, yeah, but nothing at all would have happened without it. And they are pointing to all of the things that they think are sort of positive things where if you had needed a supermajority, they wouldn't have passed. And then there was a third group of sort of more tepid, maybe deficit hawks that basically wanted to bring back what was referred to as the Conrad rule. And the Conrad rule basically said you can use reconciliation, but you can only use it to reduce the deficit. You cannot use it to add to the deficit. So, who knows? I think the thing that everybody knows, and I think it's sort of the basis of this question, is that reconciliation has become the most important, not only the most important part of the budget process, but the only way to get major legislation through the Congress. And this goes back to Roy's point about how budgeting should not dominate other processes. The reconciliation process is now the dominant lawmaking process, and there really is something wrong with that, I think.
Could I chime in,
Of course.
Cristello? Yeah, just wanted to add a bit of process info on reconciliation. So reconciliation is tied to the budget, the annual budget resolution. And the budget resolution can include reconciliation instructions for up to three separate categories: spending, revenues, and the debt limit. So theoretically, there could be three reconciliation bills in a given year. I mean, typically there's one, but according to current law, the 74 Budget Act in particular, I think there could only be one reconciliation bill, either a consolidated bill or one specifically on spending.
Got it. Thanks, Doug. So
Yeah.
these next two are close, near and dear to my heart. John Georgius asks about whether there was thought given to stronger language regarding performance-based budgets. And Dana shared some of her experience having worked at 3 agencies over 20 years. She looks much younger. About, the budget structure, like having big umbrella budget lines in some cases and much more narrow budget accounts in others. What Dana, I don't know if you want to expand on that, but talk about more about where you see this going from a performance-based budgeting perspective. Whoever wants to take that. Steve, I think
I could start. It's important to remember that Congress gave the executive a legislative framework which has been very useful for strategic planning, for developing performance measures and reporting those on a regular basis, and a whole set of integrated routines, including enterprise risk assessment and others. The Foundations of Evidence-Based Policy Act augmented that with the requirement that agencies develop a learning agenda that identifies the key questions that need to be answered in order to inform policy and budget choices. And all of that was a base on which a lot of experience and muscle memory developed over the last 3 or 4, carrying over from one administration to another until, of course, this year. And a lot of those routines are still working in the background, I have a feeling, and we'll see some strategic plans and other evidence of that soon, I hope. But in any case, they can be revived, and there's a lot of experience. The problem has been for many of us that it's not closely linked to the budget decision-making process. The development of the budget in the executive branch is sometimes disconnected to all of that work. And so bringing that together is part of the challenge here. Again, the portfolio budgeting approach, which is something the executive can do on its own, although it would be good to see others, Congress involved as well, is one way to do that, to be more strategic and especially to address problems that cut across programs and cut across agency jurisdictions, and to work on the biggest issues, spend more energy on those than what we currently work on. So that's the start, I hope.
Great. John again asks about transparency and about standardizing appropriations approaches across government. Anybody have any thoughts about a consistent accounting structure, appropriation structure among our authors?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about appropriations, and can I just use one example
Yeah.
to illustrate my thinking? This is I'm holding up the Department of Defense. They misspelled it. This is the Canadian Department of Defense. They spelled it with a C instead of an S, but that's their annual budget. on this page.
I never found you to be parochial, Steve, but go ahead. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Whereas we have two massive bills and accompanying reports, hundreds and hundreds of pages that, when they're enacted, govern how the Department of Defense executes its budget every year. And much of that is designed to make sure that organized constituencies that fund people's campaigns get their projects in the budget, and a lot of it goes to particular districts or states. And so that whole approach, I think, perhaps is obsolete and may fall of its own weight someday. If not, in the meantime, we're really hamstrung as a country because people can't act strategically. They can't be agile. They can't deal with the crises that we're going to face, the shocks that we're going to face down the road, with this kind of approach to writing budgets. So we need to change that, and people don't understand it.
Anyone else?
I'd like to make a comment about our general approach.
Yeah.
Which right now is to not get into the weeds about questions like what should be the standard form of an appropriations language, S&E or something different. That's an important question, and many of us had spent many years dealing with them. But I think our approach is quite different, is to say we need to step back and ask ourselves, what's wrong with the whole federal budget process compared to what people should want from it? Set out some basic principles and then start winnowing out some bad ideas and focusing on some good ones, whether they're radical or incremental, and put them together into a cohesive plan that we hope particularly younger senators and representatives might consider as the new system that they would be using through their careers.
Right.
And in that regard, one of the things we want to do is try and find how we can best invite others who have ideas about general principles and about specifics to join us in developing a plan that does have a real good prospect of being taken seriously.
So Michael Jacobson's question is sort of along those lines. He cynically doesn't think the current political environment is one in which we can make some significant reforms. So what is the time frame, he asks. And by the way, anybody, if I screw up your question, please raise your hand and interrupt. But what's the expected time frame for the reforms? What would need to, and then what do you think would need to change to get traction? One thing I will say is that Reform for Results is just one of a number of organizations that have been stood up to think about what comes next. And the panel will spend the next year collaborating with Democrats and Republicans in Congress who are explicitly trying to chart an agenda that lays out what comes next.
Robert, let me volunteer to answer this question, or at least try to answer
Absolutely.
the question.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We know that there are electoral cycles out there, and during the electoral cycles, people will stake out positions for the future. And we'd like to, depending on what the cycle is, depending on what the result is, have a template for people within the next 12 months. And I realize that goes beyond the current midterm elections on the one hand. On the other hand, folks don't take, most of them, there's some temporary elections filling voids, but most of them don't take office until almost 2 years from now, just about 2 years from now. So the answer is we'd love to have whoever the new congressman, Republican or Democrat, look at the ideas early in the term of the next Congress, understanding that it may be necessary for an executive to join in that conversation. And there may be a reluctance of the current administration to do so. We don't know that for one way or another. But the answer is roughly a year from now, to have something ready to be reviewed by the incoming Congress and hopefully joined to the executive. It may be that we have to wait another 2 years for the executive. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we're not going anywhere. At 80 years old, you can't say that all the time, but it's not our intention to go anywhere. It's our intention to till this field until something happens one way or another over the next several years. And that's my answer. I'd invite any of the additional members of the Budget Policy Working Group to add theirs, but that's my feeling.
I would only add that it took us a full 50 years to fully screw this up. And I think with any kind of set of reform ideas, particularly something, if you want to call it radical, I think you have to spend some time figuring out what you want to do. And you never know when the moon and the stars are going to align, but you have to have something ready when the moon and the stars do align.
And someone reminds me, and I forget who it was, that maybe you, Phil, that it was the Nixonian problems with Watergate that triggered one set of responsibilities, and then there was a second event, I'm forgetting what it was, that triggered additional changes. So there may be an external event that we can use as a catalyst for what we're trying to do as well.
So what will it take to Jason Prehedge, I hope I pronounced that right, asks about what it would take to sustain attention here. What in the past? Pardon me.
Damned if I know, Robert. We're going to do our best to work with people, remind people. And again, there's a spirit for this. There are Mr. Arrington, I know, had a series of hearings fundamentally about this question. And I believe that the minority in the House have put a bill in place. So there's interest. And now the question is, can we turn it from lip service into at least passionate lip service in moving forward with it?
If I can add one thing, the next part of my question was when we talk about budget process improvements among us budgeteers, there can definitely be some eyes glazing over for non-budget people, right? So can some of these reform ideas at the higher level, like Roy's, be packaged with case studies about actual impacts to programs not functioning anymore, economic impacts? I mean, I know there's a lot of talk about process improvement, but can the budget folks aren't always, the most extroverted? Are there ways we can tell this story better so that it relates to impacts on the ground closer?
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, although it's been tried, the Volcker Foundation under David Walker's leadership made significant efforts to do this. There have been various public affairs efforts. Doesn't mean they shouldn't continue to be tried, but we haven't obviously figured it out yet. I think we're out of questions in the chat.
Okay. We'll record any other comments in the chat. It's after 3:00, so we're a little earlier than we usually are. And anything you want to tell us, we'll receive, we'll respond to you, and we'll archive the material in a way that it can be accessed by a number of people, probably put it in some kind of a subset of the Reform for Results website. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today, and it's been terrific. But it is only the beginning of the beginning. It's not even the end of the beginning yet, to paraphrase Winston Churchill. So thanks for today. Robert, thank you for inviting us. And Robert, I turn it back to you to say goodbye.
Yeah, thank you very much to the authors, to Ed for prompting us to put this together. Since we have such an overwhelming response, we've got our next meeting is February 26th in the afternoon. It'll feature a number of folks who've been thinking about what comes next, including from the Congress. So I hope you'll join that conversation. So
I
with
can
that,
hardly wait. Hardly wait, Robert.
have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thanks.
Take care.
Great. Thanks, Robert.
Yep.